Welcome to Escape Forward, which is the space where I have the privilege of having conversations with opinion makers, policy makers, thought leaders, commentators on policy issues we are wrestling with, way beyond the antitrust domain, which used to be my original field. So today I'm particularly happy to welcome Julius Krein. Hello, Julius, welcome. He's an American conservative political writer, editor, known above all for founding American Affairs, which is a very highly regarded, very influential quarterly magazine dealing with trade, industrial policy, neoliberalism critique, role of the state, immigration, a variety of weighty topics, and has received various accolades and recognition. Is known also to be widely read in the conservative camp. So one starting point, I think, is that, Julius, you were at my big conference in January this year, and it was just 10 days after President Trump's inauguration. So it was, title of the conference was The Perfect Storm. The general atmosphere was one of anxiety, uncertainty, and really lack of clarity, of course, as to what we were going to see. And I remember asking you as a speaker at the event what you expected to be the attitude of the new US administration to Europe and to the EC in particular. And you were quite magnificent, because in a completely deadpan sort of way, said, I think that the approach of the incoming administration is that they will not care for Brussels and the EU. They will try and connect with capitals like Paris or Berlin, but that they will not be remotely concerned with Brussels. And in a room with 1,000 people in Brussels, a lot of institutions and lawyers and the Brussels bubble, as it's known, that created quite a gasp. And I made you repeat it because it was such a strong statement that people were just certainly widening their eyes. But in fact, I think that the signs have been there sort of over time. I mean, the reason we're having this conversation today is that there is, of course, a profound discombobulation in Europe around the national security strategy document that was issued just a few days ago. This has created enormous noise and near hysteria in Europe. And I plan to go through various components of it with you, because I'd like you to help unpack what you think is the sort of message there and how it comes about and what we should read into it. But the clues, the thing that is surprising is that Europeans are acting so shocked about it. The general sentiment is this is a slap in the face, this is unexpected, this is absolutely a blow. And even people who should be wiser heads describe it as an unexpected attack on Europe. But as I said, the clues were there. You started that discourse in late January, but then since then, of course, in Europe, we've seen J.D. Vance giving his well-known speeches in Paris and Munich. Then we've seen Zelensky in the Oval Office in February. Then we've seen the Liberation Day with tariffs. We've seen the capitulation deal for Europeans in Scotland with President Trump on trade. We've seen the Alaska meeting. It's not as if the writing wasn't on the wall. And indeed, even last summer, there were already documents circulating around about various versions of this civilization challenge. I had multiple discussions in DC about this loss of Western values and how we are at risk of civilization erasure and so on. So none of this should really be a surprise. And yet, as I say, the sense of shock, horror in Europe is so pervasive. I won't really indulge into this, but the headlines this week have been MAGA hates Europe. America has identified the greatest enemy, Western Europe, from a professor of international institutions. Gloves are off, US pounds the EU, MAGA pushing for regime change in Europe, MAGA driving Europe towards fascism, a worldview aligned with Russia, and certainly a big attention on tech oligarchs, as we call them here, who want to dismantle Western liberal democracy, install the far right, etc. So apologies for the long introduction, but I wanted to set the scene. And I would like you to really help us in some way understand this moment, okay? It is certainly something that, as I say, should not be a surprise for Europeans, but the reason this feels so difficult for people to process here is that there is a sense this is not just a comment on our geopolitical standing in the world, but there is a much broader critique about how Europe conducts its affairs, including things that people consider prerogative of countries such as immigration policy and so on. So how do you actually interpret this? Help us understand it. President Trump also gave an interview on Politico a few days ago, in which he was again doubling down on this idea. He kept saying, I like Europe, I love Europe, I think the leaders are weak, but I like Europe, and they're at risk of erasure. Over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me back. It seems a lot longer than 11 months. It's been a rather frantic period. And yeah, I think there does seem to be a very large gap between American and European perceptions. Even in January, when I gave those comments, from the American side of the world, it didn't seem particularly controversial, mostly just stating a reality. When I spoke in January, from the American side, it seemed to be just stating a reality. Obviously, that seemed very controversial in Europe. I would say similarly, with the national security strategy, it's really not meant to be a critique of anything. It's an attempt to grapple with the new reality in foreign policy, the competition with China, in particular, the multipolar world, really a decline in U.S. power internationally. I think there is, however, paradoxically, because the United States and the Trump administration has a certain emotional, or I suppose they would call it a civilizational attachment to Europe, that they have a particular concern for some of the internal governance issues that they don't really have with other countries. And that gets into the civilizational erasure, the immigration issues, what seems to them as a complete lack of confidence and competence. They have seen, what appears to be a Europe in decline for, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, and no ability to course correct. And I think that's deeply concerning to them. But I think, the Europeans have a bit of protagonist syndrome if they're reading this as primarily about Europe. Really, it's primarily about Asia. The Middle East, in a different way than in the past, has become a central pillar of American interest, with the Gulf states and the investment and the economic cooperation there. Obviously, the Western Hemisphere, they are increasing the priority of that with the revival of the Monroe Doctrine and the Trump corollary. And even Africa, because of the critical minerals and mining, is getting much more attention than it has in the past from this administration. So it's really not about Europe. I think a lot of those things are in there because they have the civilizational attachment, which you could, describe as ancient Greece, ancient Rome, kind of Christianity, Renaissance, classical European history, which they see the continent, particularly under the EU regime, as drifting away from, declining in economic importance, really completely declined already in military importance. and they're trying to grapple with that fact.
So what I hear you saying, and it makes a lot of sense to me, is that there is an element of European protagonism, no doubt. This is being seen as a document which majors on Europe. It isn't, but that said, it is seen as something which passes a number of judgments that are pretty painful, and some will also say, of course, unwarranted. The affection for Europe, or the curious attachment to Europe, is also present, and I can witness to the fact that when you have conversations in DC around this, genuinely people have said to me, in Europe, you are letting the values of Western civilization, which you imparted on America, where these values were born in Europe, you're letting them slip. Now we are taking care of those values much more than you are. And they are talking mostly indeed about immigration. So I recognize much indeed of what you say. But again, it is curious for Europeans to just see this, because the question is, where does this vision that Europe is wiping away, so erasing its civilization, comes from? Is it mainly driven by a perception of what European immigration policies have been doing? We'll get to the economics in a moment, but that seems to me, or to us, the main thing that motivates this. Is that right?
I think that's correct. And I think the document literally says "Make Europe Great Again" at one point, which is a sign, an indication of affection, if nothing else. But yeah, it's the immigration. It's a kind of cultural progressivism. It's what Americans would see as a radical and self-defeating environmentalism. And I think they I think I would say the Trump administration has been a bit gratuitous at times and how they have communicated these things. And even leaving aside kind of the Greenland episode earlier on in the administration, some of these things would probably be better done in private and in more diplomatic channels than in public communication. But that's not what the Trump administration is. And so they put it out there. But I think and I think, there has been some genuine concern, not only within the American right, but even beyond that, on when you see things like discussions of banning political parties that are getting 30-40% of the vote, things like that, in the name of democracy. That's very confusing to Americans. We went through our own issue. We're still going through our own issues on kind of internet censorship and discourse like that. So that's just very sensitive from our own kind of internal cultural dynamics. But the Europeans, particularly the UK, at least in the news over here, has taken a very hard line on that, and people getting fined and facing criminal prosecution for Twitter posts and things like that is very foreign, very confusing to the American mindset. And all these things added together, in addition to the economic and military international decline, sort of adds up in their mind as a form of civilizational erasure.
But one point you just raised is, of course, one that is foundational for us, because the whole and for where this critique is coming from, it's the whole issue of freedom of speech, which is at the heart of much of this disagreement. Europeans were shocked and surprised, of course, in February to hear J.D. Vance say that his view was that we do not have freedom of speech, whereas Europeans regard themselves as generally being the cradle of freedom of speech. And conversely, there is a concern that what the US, or what the current administration and people there regard as freedom of speech is quite one-sided. It's a right vision of the world and not a broader one. There is a concern that the platforms as we know them are censoring, are using algorithms to just suppress, this time views that are not popular and amplify views on the right that are popular. But at the root of it, there is a fundamental difference or a fundamental vision of what freedom of speech constitutes. It seems to me that is, of course, very different as between Europe and the US. Can you expand on that? Because people here don't really understand what the Americans are about when they talk about freedom of speech being something we don't have.
Well, I think we could have a long discussion about the philosophy of freedom of speech. I
Yeah.
think that the European and American conceptions have always been a bit different. You know, we have the First Amendment in our Constitution, which has a special status, whereas, you know, I think the ability for government to control speech in Europe has always been a little bit different. But I think, you know, what I think is often overlooked is that the relationship between the US and Europe has never been exactly as placid and tranquil as it's often romanticized to be. You know, just taking the 20th century, you had the Suez Crisis and all kinds of issues around decolonization. You had the end of Bretton Woods. You know, France sent warships to take gold out of New York in the 70s. France was in and out of NATO. You had debates over nuclear weapons in the 80s. We had all kinds of debates about Iraq, which the Europeans were right about. I think everyone would admit now in the early 2000s. So there's always been pretty sharp differences here. And I actually think, you know, taking a more material and concrete approach to this relationship is always a bit healthier. At the moment, you know, we have Europe going through its own kind of China shock and deindustrialization, which the US went through first. And given the way China has structured its economy, whether Americans and Europeans like it or not, or like each other or not, they're sort of facing the same problems. And I think it would, you know, be best to focus on kind of the positive sum forms of cooperation on the economic front that could be achieved. I think, you know, I have said this in public. I think the Trump administration has, you know, not handled that as well as they could, to put it very diplomatically. But I think there's actually going to be, you know, fairly limited agreement on the culture war issues. But I think still a lot of potential for pretty healthy cooperation on other issues. And I think, you know, one can make criticisms how the Trump administration has handled that. But I think, you know, the Europeans, mostly through sclerosis, from what I can see, have also not necessarily been the best partners either.
Sclerosis is a word that I'm afraid I will agree with. We'll get to the economics in a moment, but one of the, and leave aside the cultural wars, I agree with you, it's not something that anyone here should be so hysterical about. Um, but there is a strong sentiment in this document that somehow the European Commission, the EU, is different from Europe as a collection of states. And the kernel of that was in your talk at my conference when you said, I think they will not care for Brussels, but they will deal with Berlin and Paris. And this turned out to be true. In fact, no one comes to Brussels except once or twice. There's not been really any kind of presence over in Brussels. And yet, we know what the reason for the Brussels, for the union project is, of course. You know, historically, Europe needed to be put in a position where people didn't go to war with one another, and this was a shared objective a few decades ago. What do you think is the vision of this administration when it comes to that piece? So we see, and this is not the administration, but it's Elon Musk absolutely calling for the removal of the EU, the breakup of the EU. We need to remove it, and we need to return to member states. But what is the vision, do you think? Is there a preference for dealing with 27 individual member states? How is that possible?
I think they see the EU as, you know, an artifact of overreach. And I think, it's one thing to have a customs union or a passport union, but the introduction of the euro, the common currency, and the growing power of really a unelected in any serious way bureaucracy in Brussels take, exerting pretty significant governance over, what the Trump administration would consider real democratically constituted countries, is sort of not only ineffective, but perhaps even illegitimate. And they would probably like to see the EU roll back and devolve more of its authorities to the member states, accepting that there, will be some kind of European economic community and things like that. I think they're, perfectly happy to deal with the major member states. And that has been difficult given the internal politics of France and Germany recently. Italy, which I, didn't really mention in January, has emerged as a key partner for them. But I think, to the extent they can deal with the larger member states and reach an agreement, and then you guys can figure out, how to make it work within the Brussels framework or whatever.
And would there be a preference for a federal Europe with elected? I mean, this is something that occasionally comes through. Federal Europe elected representation. One of the critiques is, of course, you have this unelected bureaucracy in Brussels that purports to take decision on the behalf of the people of Europe, but has got no real representation. I mean, the problem we have here is one of major coordination, as you know. Nothing gets done because no one can agree on what to do. Fundamentally, some of the key levers of power are still in the hands of the member states. So, for example, industrial policy is not centralized at the EU level. The reason nobody ever does anything is because Berlin does Berlin and Paris does Paris, and there is no mechanism to coordinate everything. So the governance of such a continent becomes difficult to envision. Let me just move to another topic, which of course is very high on our mind, is the whole defense and NATO position. So the message that has come, of course, loud and clear to Europe is you're on your own. We are not going to protect you and provide the kind of umbrella we did in the past. And this is something which has landed with a thud, I think, in February when the meeting with Zelensky took place in the Oval Office. I think Europeans were pinching themselves by beginning to get the message then. And that is, I think, of course, fair enough. There is a drive to hopefully spending more and doing more in that area. What is less encouraging and clear is that what we perceive, or what Europeans perceive, as a rapprochement with Russia, and as we know, this is nothing to do with administration, but the Russian administration has approved of this strategy document, or at least have said many of the views in there they share. Because for Europe, there is a very strong sentiment now that we are on the steps of a war with Russia. A bunch of defense ministers from Eastern Europe were at an event I was at last weekend, and the message from Eastern Europe, from Poland, from Estonia, from Latvia, from these countries was, our hair is on fire. We are not faced with President Putin just being content with annexing the Donbass. He has a vision of the world which is Greater Russia, which is something he needs to reestablish and achieve. And we on the eastern flank are seeing the initial skirmishes that will lead us there. Why aren't you Western Europeans helping us more? But the bigger question is, well, if the US is not supporting Ukrainians so much, or certainly seem to be getting closer to Russia, where does that leave us? That is a major concern.
I think Ukraine and Poland are very different cases. And I think that's also the view in the US. And, I wouldn't be too concerned about defense, protection, support in those instances. But but Ukraine is a very different case than Poland, and I think there's a concern about Russia and China. There was a concern that the events of the last few years in the Biden administration pushed them together much too closely. That is, to an extent that it's dangerous for the United States. It has been interesting to see the Russians. That alliance is maybe not as tight as some feared. And I think it's funny we didn't talk about Ukraine at all in January, but I would have predicted then that the Trump administration will go out and think that they will be able to make a peace very quickly, and that will not work. And then it will be very difficult to figure out what to do. And that's basically what has happened. But I think that they do see an opportunity. Russia will never be an ally of the U.S. Per se, but it can be its own sort of national pole and exert its own interests. So it is neither is it a vassal or subsidiary of China. And I think they see a lot of opportunities for potential economic collaboration with Russia on some of these supply chains that are currently dominated by China. That without pretending that they're going to be an ally or anything, setting themselves up as an independent pole that one can at least do business with and negotiate with is a reasonable goal. And then the question becomes, what is the reasonable outcome for Ukraine? Because if the outcome is this maximalist view of Ukraine is going to reconquer all of its territory, including Crimea, I'm not aware of any credible analysis. I'm not a military expert, but I have not seen any credible military expert think that is possible. So if that is not possible, then are you going to fight this war forever, or are you going to find some kind of reasonable peace? There are a number of proposals on the table that I think may be inching toward some kind of resolution. And I think there's also a bit of a question mark of, what exactly do the Europeans want to do here? If they want to sort of take over this conflict and fight it indefinitely, I don't think the U.S. would stand in their way, but they can't do that. So a lot of this moralistic posturing comes off as just very weird and not productive at all. And I think there's also a question mark of how much is the European Commission and kind of the European integrationist crowd using Ukraine as an excuse to push their own agenda within Europe.
Quite a lot there. But I would like to move forward to the economic circumstances. You talked about common features of economic developments that Europe is going through now, that the US had to go through or went through in the recent past, the industrialization, and certainly we at the moment are at the very much receiving end of the second China shock. Again, it is hard to understand why so many in Europe are not yet seeing that as being a major problem for us. Again, at a recent event last week, the Americans in the room were saying to the Europeans, why don't you see that your issue is really China, that China is eating your lunch right now, because Chinese surplus is being directed to Europe, not so much, it bounces off the US tariff wall and comes into Europe, and that is really killing our manufacturing and so on. But more generally, the document and others have expressed repeatedly the view that, of course, the economy in Europe is in such a dire strait. Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan gave a much reported intervention a couple of days ago in which he was saying Europe's GDP is now a third less than the US, while it was the same only a few years ago, 20 years ago. We've not done anything to Europe. Europe has done it to itself, and the economic model is not sustainable. So this is clearly a diagnosis that is known in Europe at some level, but not being absorbed. And I guess that is all also part of the frustration they're not seeing anything being done about it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's why you get into these questions of civilizational erasure. Something must be going on in their minds because you've had such bad performance and you have no course correction. So are 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 is Europe actually inhibiting democratic change in some way? Those questions crop up. But yes, I think there's a deep it's not just frustration at the, differing regulations or things like that, but a genuine confusion that Europe seems unable to not only fix its problems, but even to assert its own interest in a productive way. I mean, for example, on the tech thing, and people won't like me for saying this, but I mean, I think there's probably a real negotiation there where Europe has a lot of impressive industrial assets, mostly kind of these legacy companies, legacy family-owned industrial businesses, things like that. There could be a lot of very beneficial collaboration. There's often a lot of talk about who buying the weapons and so on from the U.S. or developing them in Europe. But I think there's probably, an interesting question of how much is Europe going to ask for from the American tech sector in terms of its developing its own industries or protecting indigenous European tech companies and so on, in exchange for better cooperation on the industrial side in the U.S. or things like that. But those discussions don't ever really even seem to happen. It To the Americans, it seems like Europeans are always complaining about something, but they're never showing up with like an actual solution. Even one that Americans don't like it when Europeans talk about we're going to actually buy our own weapon or build our own defense companies and things like that. And every American official has to it's their job to sell America, but they understand this the impulse or the need to do that. But it doesn't even seem that you can get your act together on that. So there's a deep confusion that there's some kind of deeper root problem that we don't even understand.
But this is a key discussion because you mentioned the tech sector and you very likely outlined the tension there and the trade-offs. This is something which in Europe is perceived as an existential matter. Personally, I am not popular in Europe for saying that our regulatory effort has been mostly a waste of time. And people don't regard me as very much a desirable person for saying that. But Europe regards, in general, its effort to what they call tame American big tech as a fundamental expression of sovereignty, because in people's mind, it is an expression of our rule of law. So we have a set of principles of rules we have recently introduced to tame US tech. Incidentally, not to do very much in my view, but leave that aside, that there are these rules. And the fact that there is such resistance, not only from the companies themselves, but now with the backing of the administration, to essentially push back on the enforcement of these rules is deemed absolutely intolerable. And what I heard you saying is that people should be, in some sense, pragmatic and see what the bigger interest is. What does this do? What this pursuit of these rules? Is this the hill for Europe to die on? My line is that this is a stupid hill for Europe to die on. But I'm alone in saying this. Is that what you were suggesting in some sense?
Yes, though I'm not predicting that it's going to happen on either side. But I think, at least when China does this, and sort of does one-sided exchanges, technology transfers, in order to build up its own companies, like Google and Facebook are not very big in China. They have their own. Actually, even Russia has its own social media networks and things like that. Americans don't like it. They would prefer that everybody use Google, but we understand what they are doing. We understand why they are doing it. In the European case, you're not really building any of your own things. You're just sort of doing this seemingly pointless regulation to extract some fines or whatever. And one graphic that's become very popular is that the revenue from fines of American tech companies is larger than the total tax revenue of all the European tech companies put together. So it's, we just don't understand why you're even doing this.
Ultimately, there is a sense that are we going to continue to pursue this, or are we going to get clobbered on tariffs? I mean, this was the perception, although the Commission would never recognize it, the perception of the trade discussions in July and August. And since then, we had Jameson Greer here saying, well, if this regulation doesn't get under control, we could see that we are not going to be facilitating your life when it comes to steel or other type of tariffs. So this is a clear quid pro quo, which is absolutely horrifying Europeans, because in my view, they regard this as the hill to die for, and we haven't yet processed that it is not a hill that does anything very useful for Europe. I guess the disconnect is just pursuing this idealized rule of law, when in fact, in terms of economic outcomes, these rules and regulations don't do anything, seems a completely vain effort. And I guess I'm just echoing what you're saying. I struggle personally to see why this is so existential instead of building something of our own. This, again, must be one of the things that over there seems weird.
The Europeans really don't like the idea of transactional diplomacy. They want everything to be based on some kind of moral principle. And I think, that's not how the world works. And that's just gone. It's a multipolar world now. There's no one to uphold these principles. It's not going to be based on what some commission thinks is the ideal policy practice. And I think Americans have sort of moved past that and accepted it. But for the Europeans, that's pretty much all they have. And so going to a transactional arrangement is very scary for them because they don't necessarily have much to offer. And that's, unfortunate for everybody.
Well, this is harsh, but I happen to agree with much of it. As you can tell, I don't think this is going to be an uplifting conversation for Europeans listening to this. But the reasons I wanted you to be here and say it like it is, and not mince words, is because someone has got to say it in a rational and clear way that is founded on ultimately reason and not hysteria. This is what is happening over here. There is a great deal of agitation around what is being described as a sort of international fascist movement that works with backing from Moscow, Washington, and the tech oligarch. This is the big boogeyman that is talking Europe, and everyone who is a progressive or left or center person has this notion that this is really what's going on here. And that's what we need to ward against, is the fascist conspiracy of the tech oligarchs backed by Washington and backed by Moscow. And that I honestly find hysteria that I as a European don't know where to go with that.
Well, I mean, all of the people that they think are fascists, think they're fascists or authoritarians or anti-democratic in some way. So in a way, everybody thinks they're actually protecting the interests of democracy and free speech and so on. As I said, I don't think that there's going to be I don't foresee any agreement on that. That's, just a basic cultural division. But what I would say on a more positive note is that, the US has made its interests very clear, and it's open for business. And if the Europeans want to come and do a real negotiation, I think the Americans would understand that and would try to find mutually beneficial areas. There's going to be disagreements. They're not going to agree on everything. But we're actually, waiting for for Europe to, actually make us an offer on things that work for both sides. But the sort of moral blackmail just doesn't work. Saying you don't like U.S. policy and it's fascist, that nobody cares. It's
That's exactly my position. We're just sort of wasting time. Listen, Julius, I want to thank you for this. I think this was will be for the listeners quite a wake up call, because this is not where Europeans are. There is no one saying this in Europe as clearly as you did. And the purpose of doing it was really to lay it out in a way that is not hysterical or emotional, but pragmatic, and see the choices that we have. I look forward to you being again speaking at my conference in a couple of months, and I want to reprise some of this conversation. But I'm sure I cannot say that the audience will necessarily agree with much of what you said, but it needed to be said. So thank you for that clarity. Julius, before we go, there's actually one final point I wanted to make. One of the sentiments that, again, is very diffuse in Europe at the moment is a sense that it's only a question of time, that if we hang in there, there will be the midterms that will lead to a lame Trump presidency, and then there will be a return to normality, to a Biden-like world. And it seems to me that that expectation is very optimistic and not realistic. But it is very much how Europeans, at the level of institutions and elites, are hoping things will go. Would you like to comment on that?
I don't think you can count on. Again, the tone of the conversation would change, but the fundamental issues will not. U.S. competition with China and all the implications of that. I don't think any Democratic administration is going to want to see the war in Ukraine go on forever. There's still, going to be a lot of, depending on, how these things go. If you keep having, some of these parties winning 40+% or whatever, and there's all kinds of issues there. Those will all continue even under a Democratic administration. The people will probably get along better, but these issues will be with us for a long time.
I think it's fair to say that the Trump administration is making these very, very starkly clear, but the sentiment is not entirely new, in the sense that I recall during the Biden administration, when Biden officials were coming to Europe, privately they would share some of the sentiment. Oh God, we got to go there and nobody knows what they're doing. Or there was no real difference in the fundamental assessment of how things were in Europe. So I'd agree with that. The tone is different, but it's not as if it's going to be rose-tinted glasses in future. Okay. Thank you, Julius. Thanks.
Always a pleasure. And, we, like I said, if they don't agree, that's fine.
That's fine. No, I get it. But thank you again.